The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio. 96.9 FM here in Baton Rouge. Well, welcome to the show, everyone. I'm glad to have you all here. We're glad to have you all here. Lang Baker is once again with me, co-hosting and taking up all of my slack. Good evening, Lang. Thank you for being here.
Glad to be here, Wayne.
And I want to remind everyone that this is a live call-in show. Feel free, you're encouraged to do so, to call in and share your thoughts, questions, objections, corrections, challenges, or whatever on the topic of the evening. 343-9927, 343-9927. And our topic for tonight is whether or not America really has freedom of religion. I know we talk a good game about it, but are we really free of all laws that are based on religion? And Lang and I just did our individual researches on that topic, and we'll see what we came up with. I know Lang has a whole encyclopedia of stuff here that he compiled. Anyway, so let's talk about the idea of freedom of religion or whatever, or its history. Lang, you did some research on the concept, where the concept originated or whatever. Can you share?
Well, I went pretty far afield, beyond the United States and beyond the current time frame, looking at what the relationship between state power and religions have been at various times. And when I get out of bounds here in other areas, I come across some really interesting stuff I'd never heard of before, like the relationship of the Roman Empire to the religions of the various cultures and peoples that it conquered as it expanded. And of course the Roman Empire was polytheistic. In the cultures they conquered, many of them were also polytheistic, and so it was an easy relationship between the Roman powers and the religions of the peoples that they conquered, because they all subscribe to the belief that there are lots of gods out there, and these are our gods and those are your gods, and it's kind of like a hospitality thing where, okay, we the conquered people go ahead and honor the Roman gods. We respect them out of a sense of recognition of the authority of the Romans. And the Romans, on the other hand, they spent money to build temples for the gods of the peoples that they conquered, so they weren't like trying to suppress these other religions.
No, only if they tried.
Then they ran into some problems with the monotheistic religions. When they conquered Judea, the home of the Jews at that time, there was a conflict because the Jews refused to acknowledge or make sacrifices to the Roman gods in the Roman temples. But the Romans were respectful of the Jews to the extent that they said, they still made them a legal religion, and they allowed them to get by with not paying tribute to the Roman gods for a while. But then later there were some conflicts that arose when some of the subgroups within the Jewish community there rose up in rebellion against the Romans.
Yes,
and it seems like that first started from what I was reading when Nero was emperor, which is also when they first started having the Roman Empire had a problem with the Christians. They first realized the Christians were present, from what I read, around 30 A.D.
Mm-hmm.
And they were the emperor at that time wanted to recognize them as a legal religion, but the Senate, the Roman Senate, refused to grant that request, and so they made them illegal. They outlawed them as a dangerous sect or superstitious group. But the emperor didn't enforce it, so it's kind of like
I wonder what
don't ask, don't tell kind of a thing.
Yeah, I wonder what the would you call it, the pagan type, multiple gods that the Romans worshipped. That wasn't They didn't consider that superstition,
Right.
Anyway, well.
It's like, it depends on whether it's mine or yours.
Right, good point, yeah.
But Nero also cracked down on the Christians. In the story here was that when Nero's so-called fiddle while Rome burned, the Roman citizens all blamed it on Nero's, claiming he started this fire so he could build a palace, and he looked around and said, well, I need a scapegoat to blame this on instead, and he pointed out to the Christians because they were already in disfavor.
Bingo, yeah.
And so that began the persecution of Christians, was as a scapegoating cover-up to protect Nero. At the same time that he started his battle with the Jews as well.
Right.
So he must have been a kind of a combative personality, I guess.
That also played
with both of those monotheistic
also played
religions.
the violin too, I guess. But anyhow, that's something I learned too. I got to wondering when we were talking about this before going on the air, and I've always understood from the 4 Christian Gospels that were published in the Bible, as opposed to the other 129, some I guess that weren't. But the Pharisees were the ones who persecuted Jesus and were responsible for bringing him to trial and framing him, and then sending his conviction to Pontius Pilate, the Roman local leader. But the Pharisees were also a sect of the Jewish people, and of course they were much like what I would consider the organized religions of today, that are very big on aligning with the government because that's where the power is, and the Billy Grahams and people like that, and now the evangelic, those people.
Yeah,
I can't even say their name. That's how bad they are. But anyhow, tell us about how the Muslims in the Ottoman Empire handled religions, because they were a big, broad empire as well. They took up a lot.
Yeah, in fact, I discovered that the Roman Empire, it was split into the East and West, and the Eastern Roman Empire lasted until they were conquered by the Ottoman Empire in the 1400s or something like that. But the Ottoman Empire was very respectful of the variety of religions under them, although they were kind of second-class citizens. They still were allowed to have their own religious practices and observances and in their religious laws within their community. It wasn't like a respect for individual conscience of independent religious thought, but it was as a group they were, except for the heretical Muslim groups. They outlawed them altogether because they were heretics within the Muslim faith. But for the other faiths, the Christians and the Jews and whatnot. In fact, it's the oldest university, the first university founded, according to this source, was in Cairo around somewhere around the 10th century. Had lots of Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars in it. They were working together. And actually, in 1492, not only did Ferdinand and Isabella send Columbus across the Atlantic, they also kicked all the Jews and Muslims out of Spain. And the Ottoman ruler at that time sent the Ottoman Navy over to bring these refugees who were religious refugees being expelled from Spain, to bring them to the Ottoman Empire and sent out a decree that they were to be given respect and welcomed. And that was the extent of the religious freedom and respect that was being offered. It was kind of like the reverse of now, where people were fleeing that part of the world trying to get into Europe. At that time, they were being expelled from Europe and accepted with open arms in the Ottoman Empire.
Right. But
then by the end of the Ottoman Empire, as we've talked about before, at the First World War, around that time period, they were committed lots of massacres and genocides against various groups, starting from the late 1800s right on through 1920 or something like that.
The Muslims, yeah.
Yeah, the Ottoman Empire in its falling days.
Right. Okay. Well, I haven't read the history of that. It was a surprise to me to learn that the Ottoman Empire existed up until the end of World War I. I didn't know that until we did a show on that stuff.
Yeah, well, it was mentioned in the golden age of the Ottoman Empire, like when they were accepting the Muslims and Jews being expelled from Spain, that there was more religious tolerance and freedom there from the 16th century onward than the Christians in Europe were according to the non-Christians in Europe, that there was greater respect for diversity of religion in the Ottoman Empire than in the Christian Empire. In fact, the greatest expanse of the Ottoman Empire there were parts of Eastern Europe up close to Vienna that far that like 80% of the population were non-Muslim, but they were given, freedoms.
Right, but you mentioned that the Christians were the least tolerant at that time of other religions, and that was actually the case in the American colonies, and also after the American colonies became the United States. There was a lot of religious intolerance. The Puritans left, I guess it was England,
Right.
and as you said before, that they refused to be coerced into abiding by the Anglican church.
Right,
dictates.
the state religion
Right,
of England.
the
at
state
time.
religion, right, the English church, and they came over here. But when they did, they established essentially state or town mandated religions. You had something on that there where they were charging taxes and making everyone pay a fee for their chosen majority chosen Christian faith. That was the norm in America.
Right. In the colonial era, it was 9 out of the 13 colonies had official state religions. The 5 southern colonies, it was the Anglican Church, and 4 of the remaining, they had where the local town would have an election, and the church that got the majority vote was the one that would get the tax subsidies. They used state taxation to support the churches. There were 4 colonies that had freedom of religion at the time, and one was Pennsylvania, where the Quakers had settled, and then in New Jersey and Delaware and Rhode Island, which was where Roger Williams went when he had to flee the Massachusetts Bay Colony,
Right.
where the Puritans said, if you don't do it exactly the way we do it and say it has to be done, then you got to get out of here.
And they forced him out. He left. He had to flee. So that was why the state of Rhode Island was created, and why it was
the colony,
created. The colony, okay.
Providence Colony,
Okay.
and
Yeah, thanks.
he went over to England to lobby for. Massachusetts was threatening to invade and take over Providence, and Roger Williams went to England and lobbied and successfully got a charter for his colony that included in the charter the provision for the freedom of religion there.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned this to you a few days ago when we were talking about doing this show, and I want to check on it too. Speaking of religious movements invading, violently, conducting military invasions or whatever, other states or other provinces, I believe there was a Mormon uprising in Missouri way, way back in American history where they tried to take over an entire county, or some large tract of land militarily. And I want to check on that. I want to write that down now. But that was interesting. You reminded me of that. But yeah, back to Roger Williams and America. It was the Virginia delegation, and you said something about Virginia being one of the states or one of the colonies that did not have sponsored religions.
No, as a colony, it did. It was, I believe, it was one of the 5 southern ones, but
Okay.
it wasn't one of the 4 that had freedom of religion. It did have a state religion, but after the Revolution, in their state assembly of the newly independent state of Virginia, they included the protection for religious freedom.
Right, and it was the Virginia delegation to the Constitutional Convention that largely pushed for keeping religion out of it, too. I'm looking here at the amendments to the Virginia Declaration of Rights of 1776 written by James Madison, who was part of the Virginia delegation. And I don't think I'll read the whole thing word for word, but he talks about religion or the duty we owe to our Creator and the manner of discharging it are under the direction of reason and conviction only, not of violence or compulsion. So he argued against the future state of religion having any kind of special status for one particular religion. And he also argued later on, as did Hamilton and Jefferson, although Jefferson wasn't involved in the direct constitutional debates, they argued against giving tax-exempt status or special, they argued against giving or, having people pay taxes for a religion, but they also argued against granting any special favors for religion. And yet we have that today in America. That's a religious-based thing, to give churches a tax exemption as long as they don't get involved in politics. And
they're loosening that.
Yeah, of course they're loosening that because they have to, because churches are violating it, and they don't want to. I believe that anyway. They don't want to challenge it because that's a political hot potato, so to speak.
Yeah.
Anyway, listen to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker here on A Pause for Thought. We're discussing freedom of religion in America, whether or not we really have it. And Lang, you mentioned something with the Ottomans, the way they treated, with the way they allowed the different religious sects to operate, largely unmolested, as long as they, didn't stir up trouble. And I'm looking here at a Muslim newsletter, Sound Vision, and I did check, and there was another article from an American source that is, highly regarded. I mean, I'm not just taking the word for this one here, but the article makes sense. It's titled "Religious Laws and Freedom of Religion in the United States," and the subheading, or the heading of the first point they make, is Jewish Halakha, Muslim Sharia, and Catholic Canon Law. And basically, it starts off by saying that Jewish Americans have been practicing their law called Halakha since their arrival in the United States. They also operate religious courts called Beth Din, in which parties participate voluntarily. And these decisions are at times enforced by U.S. courts. The same thing with the Catholic Canon Law. There are a lot of communities that operate under that in America, as well as the Mormons, the Amish, and Muslims with Sharia law. And we've had a lot of uproar since 9/11 about the Muslims coming over here and wanting to force Sharia law on everybody. Well, no, they're not. Islam is largely Sharia law, and they're the Quran. Not the whole thing, but I think there's like 200 chapters or whatever in it that deal with Sharia law. But it's just the way they live. It's their belief system, and all of these different religious systems of justice and law operate today in America and are largely allowed and enforced by U.S. courts, provided they don't violate U.S. laws. And I think that's the way the general theory is, that if you want to voluntarily participate in a set of religious laws, our legal system, that's your business.
Yeah, I haven't studied that, but it sounds like it's kind of like contract law.
Yeah.
That you make this agreement, and then if somebody violates a contract, you can go get it enforced in court. Or people who sign arbitration agreements where they don't even get into court.
Yeah. And there's union arbitration, too. I mean, that's a separate set of rules or whatever. It's contract.
Yeah, well, that's contracted for,
yeah.
And then there are the arbitration clauses in the fine print of your credit card contract and various other corporate paperwork that we click on and agree to with never reading it.
Yes, I know, but guilty. But yeah, and I just wanted to mention one other thing about Sharia law, and I can't see it here in my notes, but there are, I think, currently 29 laws in America forbidding the establishment of Sharia law in those states. I think it is, it's state laws. And it's like, isn't that a direct violation of freedom of religion?
Well, it sounds like a violation of the Free Expression Clause of the First Amendment.
Yeah, it's like, and if they can get away with that, then why not ban? Let's not bother going there.
Yeah, let's not.
No sense in flogging that dead horse. But yeah, anyhow, let's see here. So anyway, I had expected to find a whole bunch of laws in America that were religious based when I thought of doing this topic, and I was surprised that I didn't find a whole lot. The first thing I thought of was the old so-called blue laws, which I remember in New Jersey growing up there, where every Sunday businesses had to close. The liquor stores could only sell beer on Sundays and snacks, couldn't sell liquor or wine, and all these other restrictions. And of course, when I moved to Louisiana, they had the same laws, and I was here when they finally ended the blue law regarding businesses. And of course, they passed it, and it was going to take effect, I think, 4 months later or whatever, and the businesses just said, heck with you, and they started opening up, and the state couldn't do anything about it. But most of those, if not all of those blue laws are gone. So that took away some of my fun.
Yeah, well, I guess it depends on how deeply you drill down to the motivation for particular laws as to whether you attribute it to a religious, having a religious basis or not. Like prohibition, when the 18th Amendment was passed, that was motivated in large part by Protestant denominations, most strongly in the South, but across the whole country, really. And it was clear in the open that they were doing it as a religious cause to prohibit it. And there was fight back from religions that used wine in sacrificial, wait a minute. Sacraments.
Jesus drank wine. In fact, he liked it so much he turned water into it.
Yeah. Well, see, so how far do you want to go to saying that certain prohibitions are a result of a religious motive?
Good point. And
so you can look at the drug laws, you can look at all kinds of sex behavior laws, and
that's one area I wanted to point out too is, laws prohibiting prostitution, and when in fact the sad thing is, that prohibiting prostitution creates far more harm to everyone than allowing it and regulating it would. Same thing with the drug war, really, same thing. But that's all religion and laws defining or trying to define a marriage between a man and a woman, instead of just adult human beings. That's religious based. The severe restrictions in Louisiana and Mississippi and other Bible Belt states on abortion, the outright unreasonable restrictions that they make, are nothing but religious based.
Well, yeah, even if you listen to their arguments for it, they base it on the Bible.
Right.
There was a member of the state legislature who was on the radio the other day being interviewed about this topic, and he was citing the Bible left and right as to why they shouldn't have sex education in school, and why Roe v. Wade should be overruled. It was all biblical-based argument that he was presenting. He's a member of the state legislature.
And that should be called out. And, of course, the ACLU does, but that should be frightening to anybody, really, because in the end, if we establish religious law in America, it's going to be somebody's religion that's going to win out, and everybody else's is going to lose. And that's going to cause a lot of problems. And that was the big thing, the big concern of the founders was it's something that's a matter of conscience. You can't force people to abide by any particular creed. It's going to cause, it's wrong, and therefore people are going to get angry about it and subvert everything. The law, the societies that seek to impose them, everything is going to cause chaos.
Yeah, that was the rationale for separation of church and state. And it was also a rationale for, the way the argument went in some respects was not only about battles, but also about the state would be corrupted by religion, or religion would be corrupted by the state. There are arguments, both those arguments are being asserted. And in some sects, and the Anabaptist is one I read about in here, that they take the position that once you're baptized and in the church, you should shun the worldly side altogether, and so you don't vote, you don't participate in political activity of any kind, because that's participating in the one world where you should be exclusively in the spiritual world, the world,
right.
world of godliness, instead of in the world of secular matters.
And that seems kind of self-defeating, really, because if you're not participating in the laws that affect you, you could end up finding yourself wiped out. Or like in the Navy, if you're not there, you get volunteered. We need a volunteer. Well, who's not here? Parker. Okay, let him know he's it.
Okay.
But just joking, but a little.
Yeah. Well, the one source traced it back, this idea of the two different realms, and when we've got like Roger Williams, when he left Massachusetts Bay Colony and set up Providence, he used a phrase like there should be this hedge between the two, and then Thomas Jefferson later turned that into a wall in his phraseology.
Right.
But that there will be problems arise if you allow one to influence the other.
Sure.
So it's not just like to protect individual conscience, but it beyond that, it's to maintain the purity and integrity of the religious life, to have it completely shut off from the
and vice versa,
politics, vice versa,
to not allow the religion to creep into government and allow the majority view of religion to be imposed on everybody else, which is happening now in America, although, there are good organizations fighting it, there are people fighting it. For instance, there's an article here from the ACLU dated May 23rd, 2018, that the state of Arkansas recently erected a monument to the Ten Commandments on the grounds of the state capitol. And there are 4 women who are challenging that on First Amendment grounds. And what's his name? Judge Roy Moore posted the Ten Commandments in his courtroom, and that got kicked out by the Supreme Court, I think. And then he tried to put them out in front of the courthouse, and that got kicked out. But they keep trying. I guess they're hoping that Trump succeeds, and gets plenty of evangelicals on the Supreme Court. But it's a constant fight, I think, and it looks like we're losing. The people that want freedom of conscience and freedom of religion are losing ground slowly. But we'll see. Anyway, you're listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker here on A Pause for Thought. 343-9927, 343-9927. Give us a call. We're talking about the separation of church and freedom of religion in America and whether or not we have it. So give us a call and let us know what you think about it. 343-9927. Lang, what you got?
Well, there was a New York Times editorial, or it wasn't the Times, it was published in the New York Times, but an editorial by Susan Jacoby that appeared back on the 5th of July this year, just a few weeks ago. The headline of the editorial was, "The White House is tearing down the wall between church and state." And just a few of the points that were made in here refer to the fact that Attorney General Jeff Sessions used the Bible to justify Trump's policy of separating migrant children from their parents. And then he also issued a memo on, quote, the protections of religious liberty to every federal agency. He sent out this memo to the various agencies warning that government may not exclude religious organizations as such from secular aid programs. And Scott Pruitt, in an interview with the Christian Broadcasting Network, said that Americans who want stricter environmental standards are contradicting the Bible. And so the headline in the Baptist News about that interview, the headline read, "God wants humans to use natural gas and oil, not keep it in the ground, says EPA chief."
And that was in Baptist News, presumably a pro-Baptist publication?
I would guess.
Wow.
The title.
Well, it could have been satirical.
That was the head title they got. Yeah. And the interview was on the Christian Broadcasting Network.
Look at us. We now have permission to be rich in Christ's name,
And then Ben Carson was quoted as having described the commitment to the separation of church and state as, quote, crap, prompted by, quote, political correctness. So
wonderful.
That's his characterization of the First Amendment of our Constitution.
Well, and as long as your Constitution-loving followers have never read anything that the founders wrote regarding those issues, you can get away with that, I suppose. There's one little anecdote I'd like to share with you, Lang, and everyone else, if I can fit it in the last minute. I had a friend years ago who was attending a book club, a member of a book club in Picayune, Mississippi, and she was dismayed one Sunday at our fellowship meeting, and she told me that she was dismayed because the group had recently voted to begin each meeting with a prayer, and she didn't like that. And I said, well, Mildred, I have the perfect solution for you. When they start their prayer, wait about 10 seconds, and then let out a loud whoop and fall to the floor and begin rolling around, knocking stuff over and screaming and hollering, I got the feeling, and just really get into it big time and just tear the place up. And they'll probably, react to that. Anyway.
Did she take your advice?
Probably not. I'm not sure I could do it, at least not with a straight face. But, I mean, it was a funny thought to me anyway. But, no, she didn't take my advice as far as I know. Hell, they might have killed her. I don't know. But, anyhow, that looks like it's it, Lang.
That's another exciting discovery of stuff I'd never occurred to me to try to look at before.
Yes, indeed. And, well, we always learn something new and amazing or surprising, at least to us, when we get ready for a show. Presumably, I'm sure there's somebody out there that knows it all already, and we bored them to tears to where they just went away. But anyhow, you've been listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker here on A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. We thank you for listening. We got to go. You have a good night.